Hello everyone and welcome to the AE Airsoft Tech channel. I've created this channel to share how-tos and do-it-yourself tips for maintaining your airsoft guns. In this first introductory video I wanted to share with you the process of disassembling and reassembling the VFC MP5 GBB V2 SEF trigger pack. This assembly can seem intimidating due to the number of springs and small components, but I'll step you through the entire process from start to finish. Some of the tools you'll need to complete this job include a 3mm or similar punch, a #1 Phillips head screwdriver, a pick with a 90-degree hook made out of hardened steel, Loctite number 243 or 242 or similar, any kind of blue thread locker will work, and then a nice multi-synthetic grease. So with that, let's get started in the disassembly. Okay guys, so to start the disassembly, the first thing we're going to do is actually remove the selector levers from the trigger housing pack. I've already field stripped the trigger housing assembly off of my MP5K. So once you've got that done, you can go ahead and locate the selector catch lever, which is located right here inside the trigger pack. And I'm just going to depress that with my finger, and then I'm going to rotate the selector lever forward to this position. And what that's going to do is it's going to let me pull off this right selector lever just like that. And I can set that aside. And while continuing to hold down this lever with my thumb, I'm going to just gently wiggle out the other selector lever with the axle and place that off to the side here. With those two parts removed, the whole trigger pack will now easily just slide right out of the housing. And now you've got your trigger pack outside of the housing. Okay guys, so now that we have the trigger pack removed from the housing, I'm just going to go ahead and pull the trigger to release the tension in the hammer and strut assembly like this. And with that done, we're going to start by removing the valve firing pin lock assembly. And that can be done really straightforward. We're going to use this pick. And we're going to go in through the back of the trigger housing, and I'm just going to push out this small pin, this guy right here. So that should just come right out. Yep, just like that. So we got that pin removed. And once that pin's removed, you can easily lift and rotate out the firing pin lock and put that aside. And we can also remove the firing pin lock spring, just like that. So the next step is going to be to remove the hammer and strut assembly, and this is also fairly easy. I'm going to use my pick here just to push out gently the pin that holds the hammer and Sear assembly in. So it's this pin inside the trigger pack. I'm just going to go ahead and push that out carefully. It should slide out fairly easily. I'm going to hold the hammer just because this is under spring tension. And we'll set that pin aside. And now I'm going to gently lift and simultaneously kind of rotate the hammer to the right. Just like this. You can see I'm rotating it, and I'm holding it because it's under spring tension, so make sure you have a good grip when you do this. And I'm just going to relax off of it. And that's removing the hammer, strut, and hammer spring from the trigger pack. Okay, so now that we have the hammer and strut removed, we're going to go ahead and remove the hammer latch assembly. This is also fairly straightforward. We're just going to carefully push this pin out the side of the trigger pack. As you can see, it fell right out. And now we should be able to just drop the hammer roller assembly right out the bottom. You can see too, the valve blocker actually came out as well. It was located up here. Apologies. That can come out during the firing pin lock removal. So I'm just going to set that aside. So here's our hammer roller assembly, or excuse me, hammer latch assembly. So we'll set that aside. Next we can remove the disconnector here. This should just simply wiggle out of the trigger pack like so, and can also be set off to the side. With the disconnector removed, now we can go ahead and remove the trigger and Sear assembly. So I typically like to lift the trigger spring off this tab first, just to relieve some tension. So I'm going to use my pick to do this. So we're going to go ahead and lift that up. Yep, and I just popped it off so you can see it's hanging down here now. And that just helps remove some of the tension in the trigger and Sear assembly. And then we're just going to push this pin out, just like that. Pull it out the bottom. And now the trigger spring, and Sear will all come right out of the trigger pack. We're getting down to the last couple components. So next I'm going to go ahead and remove the Selector catch lever that we used to disassemble the pack earlier. So I'm going to do that by pushing out this pin. Use our pick. I should be able to just pull that right out. And then the Selector catch lever will come right out just like that. Pretty easy. And then our last step here is going to be to remove the Selector catch lever spring assembly. So once again, I'm going to push this pin out. And you want to be careful. I'm going to hold this spring. It's under a lot of tension. And just remove that axle. And now we should be able to just push this guy right out the bottom. Yep, just like that. You'll notice there's an axle that actually rides inside of here, and then this pin goes through it. So make sure you don't lose that when you take this apart. Finally, our last step is going to be to split the trigger pack halves. So we're going to do that using our #1 Phillips screwdriver. I'm just going to go ahead and remove these bolts. With that fourth one kind of loosened there, I'm going to be able to just lift off the trigger pack half, and inside we'll have our firing pin and spring. And that completes the entire trigger pack disassembly. Okay, so now that we have the MP5 trigger pack disassembled, the next step you're going to want to take is to use a microfiber cloth or similar to wipe all the excess grease off any of these parts and clean them up. If you're disassembling this, you're probably either installing some upgrades or trying to do some maintenance, so this is a great time to get in all the nooks and crannies and remove any of the residual old dried grease from the assembly. I like to use the Superlube multi-purpose synthetic grease in the trigger pack. This stuff works pretty well. You're going to want to apply a very thin layer to any location where there's metal on metal contact. So some spots could include a little thin layer on any of these axles that run across the trigger pack for holding in the various parts, and then also where the firing pin slides inside the trigger box. Those two locations are pretty important. So I'm going to go ahead and clean my assembly up and re-grease it now, and then we'll start putting the trigger pack back together. Okay, so once we've got our trigger pack re-greased and ready to go back together, we're going to start by reinstalling the firing pin control. So this assembly here, and you're going to want to make sure that you have your spring located inside the pocket on the firing pin. And this is just going to get dropped into the left side of the trigger pack like so, with the spring sitting on this spring rest. It may fall over, but yeah, there we go. It's going to sit just like that. And then we're going to take the right half of the trigger pack and lay it on top. And now we can go ahead and reinstall our 4 screws here that hold the trigger box halves together. One thing I want to point out is one of these screws, you'll notice, has a flat cut into it. And the reason for this is when the screw is fastened inside the trigger pack, if this was not cut flat, it would protrude above this surface here. And your bolt actually reciprocates along that surface, so it could get hung up on this screw. So it's important when you reinstall these bolts that this one with the flat ground on it lines up in this location here. And you want to make sure you line up the flat with that top surface. So I'm going to go ahead and reinstall these screws, and we'll take a look right after. One more note here before I actually put the screws in. I would recommend putting a very small amount of Loctite 243 or any other blue thread locker on the bolts before reassembling. So I've wiped this off with some alcohol, and now I'm just going to put a very, very small amount just on the first couple threads there. You hopefully can see on camera just a little bit on those first 2 or 3 threads is all that it takes. And then you can go ahead and install all 4 of these, again making sure the one with the flat is in this location here. Okay, now I've got all 4 of the bolts reinstalled, and just to go over it again, I've made sure to install the screw with the flat cut into it into this position. And if I run my finger over the surface, I can tell that there's no portion of that screw head that's protruding up onto this flat plane. If you do have a little bit of the edge of the bolt hanging over, you can take a file and just clean up that edge, but you want it to feel smooth so your finger can go over it without feeling any sort of bumps or anything. And then one other check I like to do is just push on this firing pin. It should be very easy. It should spring back no problem. You don't want this to be tight or gritty, because this is what's going to actually open up the valve on the back of your magazine and release the gas into the bolt assembly. So this feels good on mine. The Loctite will help hold all these bolts in, and we're ready to move on to the next step in reassembly. Okay guys, so the first component we're going to reinstall in the trigger pack is going to be our selector catch lever spring. And this part can actually be a little bit tricky. Make sure you put your axle on the spring before you begin. You don't want to forget that. But basically what's going to happen is the spring has, put this down for a second, the spring has 2 legs on it. So one of the legs is actually going to wind up sitting on the back of this boss inside of the trigger pack. Right on that back edge, one of them is going to wind up sitting. And the other leg is going to get hooked around this portion of the selector catch lever. And it's going to be a little bit difficult to show on camera, so I'm going to probably show a couple steps here as I get the spring into each position. Okay guys, so the first step to getting the spring back in is to preload it as I've done it right here. So you can see the spring and axle assembly is located in the back of the trigger box, and I've just sort of got it started in here. And one important thing, let's see if I can focus the camera, inside there is the other leg of the spring. So what I'm going to do is reach in through this hole here in the back of the trigger pack, and I'm going to get behind the leg of that spring, and I'm going to be pushing it this direction. And my goal is to get that leg hooked onto this ledge in here. You can actually see some scratch marks from where it sat previously. And once I've got the leg hooked on there, I'm going to be able to carefully push this spring and axle assembly down until it lines up with the hole inside of or on the side of the trigger pack. And then we're going to be able to install our axle. And then we'll need to actually, then we're going to move this leg from this latch, and we're going to flex it over this boss so that it winds up on the back side where we want it. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next step. So I'm just pausing here in between so you can see I've got the leg of the spring hooked on that ledge, and I'm just holding this axle with my finger, and you can see the other legs right there. So now I'm just going to push this down until the spring and axle line up with that hole in the trigger pack. So just like this. And now you can see them lined up. So now I can install my pin, and we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, so now that we've got the axle back installed, the last step is we want to get the leg of the spring up onto this boss. You might be able to see it on camera, but there's already some wear marks here from where the spring normally sits. Doing this is going to put the most torque into this spring, and is going to help make your selector lever feel stiff when you switch firing mode. So it's important to get this up onto the boss. A lot of people I see leave it down here, but you won't get the same tension in the catch lever. And you can see on this side too, the other spring leg is going to be laying right there. So once again, I'm going to use my pick, and we'll see if I can do this on camera. We're going to want to just flex this around and onto that boss. All right, so as you can see here, we've got that leg of the spring up onto the boss here. So this is the final resting spot for it. And next we're going to go ahead and install the selector catch lever. So this is going to get installed through the bottom here. So I'm going to position the selector catch lever just like this. And what I'm going to do is reach in through the back of the trigger pack with my 90-degree hook. And I'm going to get the tip of the hook behind the spring. And I'm going to flex it away from the wall. Oop. And while I do that, I'm going to slide the selector catch lever down. So we'll try and get this on camera here quickly. So I've got it hooked and kind of flexed away. Oh, there we go. So you can see now that spring tang is in front of the tab of the selector catch lever. So once that's done, we can kind of slide the selector catch lever down into position, and we'll pick up our axle, get it started in the hole, and we'll just slide it through. Just like that until it's fully seated on both sides. And now we should feel tension when we push down the arm, and we do, nice and strong. So that's reinstalling the selector catch lever. Okay guys, so next we're going to install our trip lever. Now, this is pretty straightforward. The lever has a large hole in the bottom of it, and then there's a boss inside of the trigger pack right there. And this is just going to lay right on top, just like that. And then you're going to want to rotate it forward so that this button sticks through this hole. Okay guys, for this next part of the assembly, we're going to reinstall the sear and trigger. So these parts get loaded together just like this. We're also going to put our trigger spring back onto the trigger just like so. So you've got this little sub-assembly, and then we're going to very gently load it into the trigger pack while holding our trip lever in place until we get the pins all lined up right about there. I'm going to go ahead and get my axle started. I can feel it just went through. And there we go. Now it's all the way seated. Perfect. If we look inside keep our trip lever in place. Hold up my finger. If you look inside, we can see the trigger spring has a little hook on it, and that's correctly now installed over this boss. If yours didn't wind up over this when you were installing your Sear, you will want to get it installed now, just like I've got shown here. And now we're going to very carefully, I'm going to hold that hooked portion of the spring in place, and we're going to bend this portion of the spring back over the tab, just like so. And there you go. You can see I got it almost all the way started. I'm going to use my pick just to push it all the way. Perfect. You heard it snap in place. So that was our trigger spring. It's still hooked on that boss. Trip lever still installed. And now I should feel tension in my trigger. And that's reinstalling the Sear and trigger assembly into the trigger pack. Okay guys, this next part's pretty easy. We're going to reinstall our hammer latch assembly. The most important thing here is to just make sure that this assembly didn't come apart. You want to make sure this roller is sitting like this on both spring ends. These springs tend to separate during disassembly, so if they have, just reassemble it as I've shown here. And then you should be able to just kind of gently load this in from the bottom of the trigger pack. And I'm looking in this hole to see when everything lines up. And we're going to take our pin, reinsert just like that. And if it doesn't quite want to go all the way, you can just kind of push on this side a little bit until you just saw it. Now it's seated all the way inside the trigger pack. And that's reinstalling the hammer latch assembly. Okay guys, the next part we're going to do in the assembly here is reassemble the hammer strut and hammer spring. This part is a little bit of a pain, but it's not too bad. So the idea is we need to compress this spring onto the strut while feeding it through the trigger pack so that the tip of the strut sticks through the trigger box. And once we've got that, then we should be able to push the hammer and strut assembly in and then rotate it down and into the trigger pack like that. So I'm going to go ahead and just pre-compress some of the spring and then feed it into the trigger pack. You do need to keep the hammer at kind of a shallow angle like I've done here in order to get the strut through the backside. Let's see if I can get this on camera. Oh, there we go. So I've gotten it through. Now I've just rotated it down and pushed the hammer down to align with this hole right here. So I'm holding the hammer in place with my right hand. I'm going to grab my pin and get it started here. And now we're just going to carefully see if we can find. There we go. Yep. There we go. Now the pin's back in. The hammer is installed. So once you've got the hammer installed, you can do a quick function check. I'm just going to cock it, push down on our trip lever, and then pull the trigger, and it should fire. So we look like we're in good shape there. I'm just going to recock the hammer and re-hit the trip lever. So for our last step, we just got to reinstall, or second to last step, we got to reinstall our firing pin lock. So that's pretty straightforward. We're going to load the spring into this pocket right here, just like that. And then our firing pin lock's gonna kind of rotate in a little bit underneath. And now I'm gonna push down until this pinhole lines up. And then we're gonna put the short pin here in. If you notice, one end of the pin has a small chamfer cut on it, and you want that end to go towards the inside. So here we go. Now it's installed. Let's see, we're spring loaded. I'm going to go ahead and put the lock back in, so you can see the bottom side has this kind of raised edge. That's going to go in just like this, and that's going to lock that firing pin in place. Now we've got our trigger pack fully reassembled, so we're going to go ahead and reload it into the trigger housing. It's going to simply slide in like this until we can see cleanly through the selector hole. Now I'm going to push down on our selector catch lever. We're going to take our selector axle and load it through. And once it's popped through, we can then just simply install the other side of the selector lever. And we should be good. So we're in safe, pull the trigger, nothing happens. We go to semi-auto, pull the trigger, hammer falls. So that concludes my video on disassembling and reassembling the VFC MP5 GBB Navy SEF style trigger pack. And thank you for watching.